He stepped into court to defend his brother, calm, quiet, and just 17. But before he could speak, a white cop shouted he was lying. The judge didn't say a word. Until hours later, when he looked at the boy and called him son. What truth was this teenager carrying that shook the courtroom so deeply? If this story grabs your heart, like it did mine, tap, like share it with someone who still believes in quiet strength, and subscribe for more true to the bone stories. Now let me take you inside the room where one boy's truth made the system tremble. It was just after 9 when the double doors of Courtroom 3B eased open, letting in a stream of muted footsteps, stiff jackets, brushing against benches, and a kind of hush that only shows up when something bigger than a trial is about to happen. Hillsford wasn't a place known for drama, but that morning there was a heaviness in the air, like the walls themselves knew they were about to hold something unforgettable. Elijah Reed sat at the defense table, hands still, eyes steady, his face unreadable to those watching. 21 years old, a former community college student who worked nights to help his grandmother and younger brother. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was the man accused of attacking a police officer at Fairview Park. They said he lunged. They said he swung. They said he ran. Judge Malcolm Everett entered without fanfare. He always moved like the air around him didn't need announcing. At 58, his reputation stretched across districts. People called him firm, fair, and frightening in his silence. He lowered himself into his chair with the grace of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and looked briefly over the room, his gaze passing across the rows of observers, pausing for half a second on Elijah. His expression did not change. To his left, the assistant district attorney, Brent Keller, sat organizing papers he had already memorized. Keller was white-polished and calculating, the kind of man who made every word land exactly where he wanted. He leaned back, legs crossed, just enough to show confidence, and tapped his pen once, twice, 3 times against his folder, a habit he used when gearing up to dismantle someone's credibility. Seated directly behind him was Officer Lydia Harrow, the woman who said Elijah had assaulted her. She was stiff in her uniform posture, tight mouth pulled into a line that never quite softened. Years on the force had taught her how to hold herself like stone, but her eyes were active, sharp, watching, waiting. And in the back corner, barely noticeable to those who didn't know where to look, sat Ruby Reed. She wore a faded scarf and kept her coat on despite the room being too warm. Her hands rested on her lap, one thumb moving back and forth over a folded photograph she'd carried with her for years. She didn't speak. She didn't shift. But her presence anchored the entire space like someone who had already lived through too much to be surprised by anything else. The courtroom settled into its formal rhythm. The charges were read. The jury was addressed. Keller stood and painted a picture of a violent, unpredictable young man who had disrespected law and order. He used careful words, polished phrases, drawing lines between duty and danger, between uniform and threat. He spoke as if every sentence carried the weight of public safety, and his voice never once faltered. The defense attorney, Ms. Rivera, remained composed, occasionally jotting notes while Keller spoke. She didn't interrupt. Not yet. She was new to the case, but seasoned enough to know when to stay quiet. Her face betrayed no reaction, but her hands gripped her pen a little tighter every time the word assault came up. Still no one spoke of Micah. There was no mention of a second brother. No hint that the story the jury was hearing might be incomplete. Not from Keller, not from Rivera, not even from Ruby. But the silence carried weight. And for anyone who listened closely, there was something hanging in the air like a story not yet spoken, a name not yet called. As Judge Everett turned the page in his notes and adjusted his robe, his fingers paused over a small crease in the corner of one folder. He looked up, just for a moment, not long enough to make a statement, but long enough to suggest he noticed something. Then his face closed again. He gave a short nod. The clerk rose, and Officer Lydia Harrow stepped forward to take the stand. She swore her oath. Her voice was clear, steady, but when she glanced toward the gallery, her eyes lingered for a moment on the space beside Ruby Reed, an empty chair, her brow furrowed almost imperceptibly, as if someone she expected to see wasn't there. And still the name hadn't been spoken. Micah Reed. Not yet. But the moment he did enter that courtroom, everything they thought they understood would begin to unravel. The courtroom was beginning to breathe again. After Officer Harrow's testimony, the air had grown still as if the story had already been told, and all that remained was the formality of sentencing. Even Judge Everett seemed ready to shift forward. His fingers rested on his notes, prepared to turn the page. Then the voice came soft, firm, and completely unexpected. The defense calls Micah Reed, brother of the accused. Time did not stop. It changed shape. It bent like heat rising from asphalt, warping everything in its path. Assistant District Attorney Brent Keller shot up from his seat so quickly, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed. The prosecution was not given fair notice. The integrity of this proceeding, Judge Everett did not respond immediately. He simply raised one hand, his palm toward Keller, asking for quiet without needing to raise his own voice. Then he turned his attention to the defense. Ms. Rivera stood calm and centered. Her voice was steady. Micah Reed was not available until this morning. He was present the night of the incident and has direct knowledge. The defense respectfully asks the court to hear what he has to say. Keller shook his head with a scoff that he didn't bother to hide. A 17-year-old, a brother now. Judge Everett looked out across the courtroom, past the bench, past the attorneys, toward the back, where Ruby Reed still sat, her hands now twisted tightly in her lap. Then slowly, and without another word, he reached for his gavel and tapped once. Let's hear him. The door to the courtroom opened, and the world seemed to tilt. Micah Reed walked in. Not hurried, not afraid, but not overconfident either. He was 17, tall but narrow in the shoulders, wearing a shirt that didn't quite fit, and shoes that bore the scuffs of real life. His tie was crooked. His collar sagged. But none of that seemed to matter once you looked at his eyes. Because his eyes were locked on the bench, he didn't scan the room. He didn't glance at Elijah or Keller or even Ms. Rivera. He walked a straight path, as if he had memorized every step before the door had even opened. He was almost to the witness stand when Officer Harrow stood. But she did not simply rise. She erupted. He's lying, he's not credible, he's covering for his brother. Her voice cracked like a whip, wild and uncontrolled. She wasn't the calm, collected officer who had testified an hour ago. She was something else now, something breaking. The jury jumped. Keller froze. Ms. Rivera didn't flinch. Judge Everett's voice hit like a sudden thunderclap. Enough. One more outburst. Officer, and I will hold you in contempt of court. His gavel came down hard. The echo didn't just fill the room. It stayed there, vibrating through the walls, through the benches, through the silence that followed. Officer Harrow sat down without another word, but her breathing was sharp, her hands clenched into fists, and her gaze never left Micah. Micah climbed the 3 steps and sat in the witness chair. He adjusted the microphone not because he needed to, but perhaps because it gave him something to do with his hands. He raised one hand and took the oath. His voice was clear. I do. He looked forward again, but now it was not just forward, it was directly at Judge Everett. And Judge Everett looked back. Their eyes locked, and for the first time all day, Everett hesitated. A flicker passed across his face. He blinked. Not quickly, not sharply, but slowly, as if part of him needed a second longer to process what stood in front of him. Ms. Rivera remained quiet, letting the air settle. Then she asked, Micah, where were you on the evening of April 14th? Micah didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply said, I was there. With my brother. I saw everything. The effect was instant. The courtroom no longer belonged to the attorneys or the process or even the judge. It belonged to this boy, a boy who had just placed himself at the center of a case no one expected him to enter, a boy who stared down a system meant to silence him. And although the judge said nothing, although he sat still and composed his fingers, tapped once, barely audible, and his throat tightened before he swallowed. Because whether he would admit it or not, Judge Malcolm Everett had recognized something in Micah Reed, and deep down, something inside him already knew what was coming. The courtroom was holding its breath, not in silence, but in tension. Every eye locked on the boy in the witness chair, every spine straightened without knowing why. It wasn't the drama of what he might say, it was the calm before it. Micah Reed sat with his back straight, hands folded in front of him. He didn't shift in his seat or clear his throat. He just looked forward, steady. When he finally spoke, it was soft, like a memory, not a statement. It was about 8:30. Elijah had just finished work. We walked through the park like we always do. He had his hands in his pockets. I was a few steps behind him, texting our grandmother. We weren't doing anything wrong. No one interrupted. Not yet. Micah continued, his voice even measured, like each word had been weighed before it left his mouth. Then we heard yelling. A flashlight hit Elijah's face. Officer Harrow told him to stop. He did. He raised his hands. Told her he lived 2 blocks away. She said he was being aggressive, but he didn't move. I remember everything. He paused, not because he forgot, but because he remembered too well. She grabbed his arm. He flinched. She shoved him down. I ran toward them, shouting his name. She pulled out her baton. Elijah didn't hit her. He was trying to get up when she struck him. A shift moved through the room, barely perceptible but real. Micah's story was no longer just a retelling. It was a quiet confrontation. Assistant District Attorney Brent Keller leaned forward, lips tight. His voice was cool, almost mocking. Rehearsed testimony. Or do you just have photographic memory? Micah didn't blink. I remember everything. That's why I came. No drama, no anger. Just a sentence that echoed louder than any gavel. Then Ms. Rivera rose from her chair and addressed the judge. Your Honor, we ask to present Exhibit 7, surveillance footage from Gomez Market across from the park. Judge Everett nodded once. The lights dimmed. A screen lowered. What followed was grainy and gray, but clear enough. Elijah stood still as Officer Harrow approached, her flashlight shining directly into his face. He didn't lunge. He didn't raise his voice. His hands were in plain sight. Then she reached, grabbed his wrist. He jerked back instinctively. She shoved him. He stumbled, tried to get up. She struck him twice. The courtroom held still, as if afraid to breathe. And then in the far side of the screen, Micah appeared, running toward them, too late to stop it. The screen went black. Silence. Judge Everett leaned back slowly. One hand gripped the armrest of his chair, not in judgment, but like he needed something solid to hold on to. His eyes stayed on the blank screen as if the truth was still playing there. In the gallery, Ruby Reed wiped her eyes without lifting her head. Micah sat motionless, hands folded again, waiting. And in that hush, something heavier than a verdict settled over the room. Truth had found its voice. And the system had no choice but to listen. The courtroom was still echoing with the silence that had followed the footage. People weren't shifting. They weren't murmuring. It was that rare, suspended kind of quiet when everyone knows they've just witnessed something they weren't supposed to forget. Officer Lydia Harrow sat stiffly in her chair, arms locked across her chest. Her face had gone from stone-cold certainty to something brittle, something that didn't quite know how to hold itself together anymore. And then she leaned ever so slightly toward her attorney and muttered under her breath, not loud enough for the jury to hear. Maybe not even for herself. But Micah caught it. He edited that. They're trying to set me up. Micah didn't flinch. He just looked forward, eyes steady. There was no victory in his face, no smug satisfaction, only the same quiet weight he'd carried since the moment he stepped into the room. Then he turned his head slowly toward Judge Everett. And in a voice low, almost as if it was only meant for 2 people in the entire courtroom to hear, he said, "He told me. If I ever ended up in court, I should look him in the eye. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a demand. It was something more dangerous than both. It was memory." The words didn't land with a bang. They didn't cause gasps or outbursts. They just hovered like dust catching light, slow to settle but impossible to ignore. Judge Everett didn't speak, didn't move. His face twitched, not in recognition, but in something far deeper, like a ripple of memory pushing up from somewhere he'd buried a long time ago. His hands, once firm on the bench, now shifted slightly, a tiny betrayal of the control he was known for. In the gallery, people looked at one another confused. The sentence hadn't made much sense to them, but something about the way the judge froze, about the way Micah held his gaze without blinking, told them this was no ordinary exchange. Attorney Keller straightened up. "Objection, Your Honor. What exactly is this supposed to mean?" But Judge Everett didn't respond. Not immediately. He kept his eyes on Micah. And for a moment, that courtroom, so formal, so rigid, so bound by rules and roles, felt like a place where something older was being remembered. Something personal. It passed quickly. Everett blinked, exhaled, and turned toward Keller. Objection sustained. Let's stick to the facts. Counselor Rivera, but his voice had a crack in it. Barely there. Enough for those who were listening closely to hear the shift. Ms. Rivera didn't push further. She simply nodded and stepped back, letting the weight of the moment settle where it needed to. Micah remained still in the witness chair. He wasn't trying to convince anyone now. He had already said what mattered. The rest of the trial might belong to the lawyers, but that one sentence, those quiet words, had slipped past the arguments and landed somewhere deeper. And though no one in the room could name it yet, something fundamental had changed. The next witness moved slowly to the stand, her steps steady but heavy, like each one had been weighed down by years of silence. Ruby Reed didn't glance at the gallery or the jury. She kept her eyes forward as if she had waited too long for this moment to waste a single second looking away. She sat down gently. Her coat was modest, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But there was a stillness in her posture that commanded the entire room. When she spoke, her voice was soft at first but clear. I'm Elijah's grandmother, and Micah's too. I raised them after their mother passed. It was the kind of sentence that seemed ordinary on the surface but carried a weight that pulled the air out of the room. No one moved, not the jurors, not even Keller. Ruby looked down for a second, her voice catching just a little before it steadied again. Her name was Elise Walker. My daughter. She was smart, kind, stubborn in the best way. Got into college early, had dreams, big ones. She paused, her eyes distant but focused. She stayed behind for him, for the man who told her he loved her. She believed him. And then she got pregnant. A quiet wave seemed to ripple through the courtroom. No gasps, just silence pressing in from every wall. She wasn't afraid of being a mother, Ruby said. She was afraid he'd leave. And he did. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble with anger. If anything, it felt like someone reading a letter written years ago, already folded and faded. Attorney Keller leaned forward slightly, his tone cautious. Ms. Reed, do you know who the father is? Ruby turned her head slowly toward him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look to the judge. She simply said, I do. He left the moment Elise told him she was pregnant. Never came back. Never asked about the baby. Never once looked his son in the eye. Keller glanced toward the judge's bench but said nothing more. He didn't need to. Neither did Ruby. Judge Everett sat motionless. His hands resting atop a stack of files began to shift. He opened the case folder in front of him and turned the page with deliberate care. There it was, printed neatly near the bottom, Elise Walker. The name stared back at him like a ghost he had spent half his life forgetting. He didn't speak. But his expression changed. Just barely. A slight tremor in his fingertips as he slid the page back, a subtle breath that caught before it left his chest. Micah, still seated beside his defense attorney, watched him. He wasn't looking at Ruby. He wasn't reacting to Keller. His eyes stayed locked on Everett, quiet and steady, like a boy who had waited years for a man to see what he had become. The courtroom didn't know what to make of it. The jurors looked from Ruby to the judge, then back again. No one said a word, but the stillness said enough. For the first time, the truth wasn't in the testimony. It wasn't in the files or the footage. It was in the space between people. In the way Judge Everett's shoulders seemed just a little heavier. In the way Ruby Reed closed her eyes after finishing her sentence, like she had finally set something down after holding it for decades. Micah didn't smile, didn't flinch. But in that silence, something passed between him and the man behind the bench. And though it was not spoken aloud, it was heard by everyone who had been listening closely enough. What had started as a case about violence in a park was no longer just about a punch or a badge. It was about a name, a mother, a silence that had lasted 17 years too long, and the judge who finally had to hear it. The next witness moved slowly to the stand, her steps steady but heavy, like each one had been weighed down by years of silence. Ruby Reed didn't glance at the gallery or the jury. She kept her eyes forward as if she had waited too long for this moment to waste a single second looking away. She sat down gently. Her coat was modest, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but there was a stillness in her posture that commanded the entire room. When she spoke, her voice was soft at first, but clear. I'm Elijah's grandmother, and Micah's too. I raised them after their mother passed. It was the kind of sentence that seemed ordinary on the surface, but carried a weight that pulled the air out of the room. No one moved. Not the jurors. Not even Keller. Ruby looked down for a second, her voice catching just a little before it steadied again. Her name was Elise Walker, my daughter. She was smart, kind, stubborn in the best way. Got into college early, had dreams, big ones. She paused, her eyes distant but focused. She stayed behind for him. For the man who told her he loved her. She believed him. And then she got pregnant. A quiet wave seemed to ripple through the courtroom. No gasps. Just silence pressing in from every wall. She wasn't afraid of being a mother, Ruby said. She was afraid he'd leave. And he did. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble with anger. If anything, it felt like someone reading a letter written years ago, already folded and faded. Attorney Keller leaned forward slightly, his tone cautious. Ms. Reed, do you know who the father is? Ruby turned her head slowly toward him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look to the judge. She simply said, I do. He left the moment Elise told him she was pregnant. Never came back. Never asked about the baby. Never once looked his son in the eye. Keller glanced toward the judge's bench but said nothing more. He didn't need to. Neither did Ruby. Judge Everett sat motionless. His hands resting atop a stack of files began to shift. He opened the case folder in front of him and turned the page with deliberate care. There it was, printed neatly near the bottom, Elise Walker. The name stared back at him like a ghost he had spent half his life forgetting. He didn't speak, but his expression changed, just barely. A slight tremor in his fingertips as he slid the page back, a subtle breath that caught before it left his chest. Micah, still seated beside his defense attorney, watched him. He wasn't looking at Ruby. He wasn't reacting to Keller. His eyes stayed locked on Everett, quiet and steady, like a boy who had waited years for a man to see what he had become. The courtroom didn't know what to make of it. The jurors looked from Ruby to the judge, then back again. No one said a word, but the stillness said enough. For the first time, the truth wasn't in the testimony. It wasn't in the files or the footage. It was in the space between people. In the way Judge Everett's shoulders seemed just a little heavier. In the way Ruby Reed closed her eyes after finishing her sentence like she had finally set something down after holding it for decades. Micah didn't smile, didn't flinch. But in that silence, something passed between him and the man behind the bench. And though it was not spoken aloud, it was heard by everyone who had been listening closely enough. What had started as a case about violence in a park was no longer just about a punch or a badge. It was about a name, a mother, a silence that had lasted 17 years too long, and the judge who finally had to hear it. Judge Everett sat unusually still, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as if bracing for something unspoken. The silence in the courtroom stretched just long enough to make people shift in their seats. Then he leaned slightly forward and asked almost too softly, Micah, what was your mother's full name? Micah didn't hesitate. Elise Walker. The name hit like a dropped glass. No one said a word, but the energy in the room changed instantly. Something unseen passed between the judge and the boy. Keller glanced up puzzled, but the judge had already turned away. Everett's jaw clenched for just a second, then he reached for the gavel. This court will recess for 15 minutes. The sound of the gavel echoed like a crack of thunder. He didn't look back. He rose, descended from the bench with careful steps, and exited through the side door that led to the judge's chambers. Behind that door, the walls felt closer, heavier. The room was small and wood-paneled, quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock. Everett moved like a man carrying something much older than the case in front of him. He stepped to the coat rack, reached into his suit pocket, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He didn't open it right away. For a moment, he just held it in his hand, staring at it like it might fight back. Then he slowly flipped it open. Inside, tucked behind a few crisp bills and a folded business card, was an old photograph. A girl with kind eyes and a crooked smile. She was laughing, her head tilted slightly to one side like someone had just called her name from across the room. Elise. He reached deeper and pulled out a thin, folded sheet of paper. It had yellowed at the edges and was soft from years of being handled. He opened it slowly. It was a birth certificate. The child's name, Micah Elijah Reed. Mother, Elise Walker. Father left blank. He stared at the blank space, not for the first time, but this time it wasn't empty. Not really. The silence outside the room no longer felt like silence. It felt like an entire courtroom holding its breath. In that space of quiet, Everett sat down. Not like a judge, but like a man who had just remembered he was human. The photo in his hand trembled slightly. He had told himself 1,000 stories over the years. That Elise was better off without him. That she didn't want to be found. That maybe the baby wasn't his. But none of those stories stood up now. Not in front of the boy who had walked into his courtroom and looked him in the eye with the quiet weight of someone who wasn't looking for punishment, just the truth. On the other side of the wall, Micah sat on the witness stand waiting. He wasn't looking at anyone else. Just at the bench where Everett had been, the same way a child watches the door hoping for someone to come back through it. He had waited 17 years for a name, and now the only man who could say it aloud had left the room. The courtroom had never felt more still than in the moment Judge Malcolm Everett finally leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "Micah," he said, "what was your mother's full name?" The young man answered without hesitation. "Elise Walker." For a moment nothing happened. No movement, no reaction. Just air hanging thick with something unspoken. Then Everett slowly reached for his gavel, tapping it twice against the block. "We will take a recess." He stood up, but his posture had changed. His shoulders were tighter. His eyes avoided everyone's gaze. As he stepped down from the bench and disappeared through the door leading to his chambers, the entire courtroom stayed frozen, unsure whether they had just witnessed something private or something historic. Micah remained seated in the witness chair. His fingers rested on the wooden arms, calm but alert. His eyes followed Everett's path until the judge was gone. He did not look confused. He looked like he had known this would come. In the judge's private chambers, the room was dimly lit. The polished oak desk stood silent, untouched. Everett closed the door behind him and walked slowly to the sideboard where he poured himself a glass of water but did not drink it. He set it down untouched and reached into the inside pocket of his robe. From it, he pulled a worn leather wallet. His hands, which had once written thousands of verdicts and presided over countless trials, now trembled as he opened it. Inside was an old photograph no larger than a business card. The corners were curled. The image had begun to fade, but her smile had not. Elise in her 20s, standing under a magnolia tree in springtime sunlight, in her hair eyes full of defiance and softness at the same time. Everett stared at it like it held the answer to every question that had ever haunted him. He set the photo down, and beneath it, tucked in the folds of the wallet, was another paper. He unfolded it carefully, the creases nearly split from years of pressure. It was a birth certificate. The name of the child, Micah Everett Walker, and in the space where it asked for father's name, it was blank. His breath caught. All those years ago, Elise had told him she was pregnant. He had said words he never had the courage to take back. And when she left, he let her go, believing it was the safest thing. That silence was a kind of mercy. But now that silence was in the courtroom, sitting in a wooden chair, bearing his last name as a middle one, and speaking truths that made grown men flinch. Judge Everett closed his eyes. It was not guilt that overwhelmed him. It was recognition. Not of Micah as a boy, but of Micah as a mirror. A reflection of what he had abandoned and what had somehow survived. Out in the courtroom, people murmured quietly, wondering what had just happened, what recess meant. But Micah did not speak. He stayed right where he was, watching the door where Everett had vanished, as if waiting for a man not just to return, but to decide who he was going to be when he did. The courtroom had gone silent. The door creaked as Judge Malcolm Everett stepped back into the chamber. Every eye turned toward him. His robe still carried the weight of authority, but his steps felt different now, slower, as if each one carried a burden he'd been avoiding for decades. He didn't take his seat immediately. Instead, he remained standing by the bench, placing both hands firmly on the wood. His voice, when it came, was clear and trembling. "I recuse myself from this case," he said, eyes sweeping across the room but never quite settling, "because this witness is my son." A sharp gasp broke out from one corner of the room. Another followed. And then silence. Not the kind that simply lacks sound, but the kind that holds breath, that grips the walls and waits. Micah Reed sat motionless on the witness stand. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just looked at the man before him, the one who had spent the entire trial behind a wall of robes and rules. Now that wall had a crack. And through it, a boy was staring into the soul of the man who should have stood by him all along. The gallery was frozen. Ada Keller glanced at the court reporter, then back at Judge Everett, unsure whether this was real or some elaborate misstep. Even Officer Harrow seemed to shrink into her chair, the fire in her earlier outburst now a mere flicker. Micah leaned forward slightly, not in anger, not even in disbelief. Just quiet clarity. "You could have said that," he said, voice barely above a whisper, before the world had to hear it. And in that moment something shifted. Judge Everett did not argue. He did not raise his voice in defense. He did not posture like a man used to being right. He stepped down slowly, one foot after the other, until he was no longer behind the bench, but standing at ground level with everyone he had once stood above. He looked at Micah. Really looked. Not at a defendant, not at a witness, not even at a name on a file, but at a boy who had lived 17 years with questions, with half-truths, with silence where a father's voice should have been. For the first time in all the years he'd served, Judge Everett looked smaller than his title, and more human than ever. "I didn't know how to be what you needed," he said, not to the court, but to Micah alone. "I told myself it was better if I stayed away, that I would only complicate your life, that maybe you were better off not knowing." Micah's eyes never left his. "And when I walked in this room today," the judge continued, voice faltering, "I thought I could do my job, just my job. But when you sat there and looked at me like that, I knew I'd failed at something much bigger than this bench." A tear escaped from the corner of Ruby Reed's eye as she sat in the gallery, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. She had known. All these years she had carried the truth. But it wasn't hers to speak, not until the silence became louder than any words. Someone in the back of the courtroom began to cry. Not loudly, but just enough to remind everyone that what they were witnessing wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was life, raw, unfiltered, messy, and magnificent. Judge Everett turned to step away, but paused, one hand resting on the wooden rail. "I will not pretend that an apology today can undo the absence of 17 years. But I will say this," he said. "You deserve to know, and I should have been brave enough to tell you." Then he turned and walked slowly down the aisle past the rows of stunned observers, past the boy who had spoken truth to power with nothing more than a steady voice and a clear heart. Micah sat still, his expression unreadable. But something in his posture changed just slightly. His shoulders, once tense and drawn, now lowered. Not in defeat, not even in relief, but in acknowledgement. Because sometimes the moment a man admits his failure is the moment he starts to become something more. The courtroom did not erupt in applause. There were no grand gestures, just silence, deep, aching, honest silence. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between father and son. Not forgiveness, but the beginning of something that might one day lead there. When the trial was transferred to federal court, everything changed. The footage had spoken louder than any closing argument. Elijah Reed, the quiet young man who had once stood trembling at the defense table, was exonerated. The judge's gavel did not just fall, it echoed. And that echo reached far beyond the courtroom walls. Officer Lydia Harrow was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The department declined to comment, but her name was already spreading across the media for all the wrong reasons. Her testimony had collapsed, her credibility had vanished, and now every arrest she had ever made was being quietly re-examined. Outside the courthouse, the front steps turned into a sea of reporters. Cameras clicked, microphones pushed forward, voices shouting over one another, all hoping for a quote, a look, a moment. But in the middle of it all stood Micah Reed, a teenager in a simple gray hoodie, his school backpack still hanging over one shoulder. He did not search for the spotlight. He just stood where he was, quiet as ever, while the world came to him. One reporter, louder than the rest, finally got a question through. She asked, "How does it feel to find out the judge in your brother's trial is your father?" Micah paused. The crowd leaned in. Then he answered with a voice that was calm and steady. I didn't come here looking for a father. I came because someone needed to tell the truth. That sentence made headlines before sunset. News outlets replayed it across the country. Social media turned his words into rallying cries. Hashtags appeared almost instantly, phrases like Micah spoke and justice. Without noise and quiet truth carried his face and his message into millions of homes. In barbershops and libraries, on buses and breakfast tables, people repeated that quote. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. The kind of honest people could feel in their chest. Micah did not need to shout. He did not need to fight. He simply stood still and told the truth, and it shook everything. One online comment that went viral read, "He changed the courtroom and the conversation." And he did it without ever raising his voice. In Hillsford, small but permanent changes began. The mayor's office announced the creation of a civilian oversight committee. Police leadership pledged to review officer conduct policies. At the school board meeting, a teacher mentioned Micah by name, while proposing a new curriculum on ethics and civic responsibility. But while the city talked about him, Micah returned to school on Monday like any other day. He walked through the halls as students whispered. Some nodded in quiet respect. Others could not meet his gaze. A few apologized. Most just watched. When someone finally asked him how it felt to be a national figure, he shrugged and smiled a little. That was never the plan, he said. Later that week, an envelope arrived at the school office addressed to him. It was handwritten. There was no return name. But in the top left corner, someone had written 3 small words. From your father. Micah took the envelope. He held it unread all the way home. He placed it on his desk, sat by the window, and stared out at the courthouse lights, glowing faintly in the night. He did not open it. He just stood there in silence. And to no one in particular, in a voice so low it was almost breath, he said, I came to speak the truth. Everything else was never mine to carry. The light in Hillsford Park had that golden softness only late afternoon could bring. Trees swayed gently overhead, scattering bits of sunlight across the grass, like pieces of a broken promise trying to reassemble itself. Micah Reed sat alone on a bench near the playground, a book resting quietly in his lap, though he had stopped reading a while ago. He was just watching the stillness of it all, breathing in the peace he had never asked for, but now deeply needed. From a distance, a pair of footsteps approached, slow and unsure, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who had rehearsed the moment in their head 1,000 times but still did not know how to begin it. Micah looked up. Standing before him was Judge Malcolm Everett. His suit was neatly pressed, but something in his shoulders had given way. Not to time, to truth. He held something in his hand. It was small, soft. A faded hospital bracelet, the kind they put on newborns. The letters were still visible, though time had tried to blur them. Micah Elise Everett. That was the name printed there, his mother's name, and now finally his own. Everett sat down beside the boy. Not too close, just enough that the silence between them felt deliberate, not awkward. He looked at the bracelet for a long time before he spoke. I carried this for 17 years, he said. Not in my wallet. In my conscience. I never signed the birth certificate. I told myself it was complicated, that it was better this way, that I had a career to protect. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what people would say. Afraid of what I'd see in your eyes. Micah said nothing. He did not move. But he listened. Not just with his ears. With everything. Everett set the bracelet gently on the bench between them, as if it were something sacred. Something fragile enough to shatter if handled wrong. Then he turned to look at his son, his voice lower now, stripped of every layer that once made him a judge. I can't undo 17 years, Micah. I know that. And I don't expect you to forgive me just because I showed up now. But if you would let me try to earn the next 17, I will. I'll try. Every day. The moment stretched long and quiet. A breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter rang out, bright and free. Micah did not cry. He did not smile. He simply reached down, picked up the bracelet, and held it in his hand for a moment. Then he placed it gently into the front pocket of his hoodie, and that was enough. They sat there for a while, saying nothing more, just sharing the quiet, sharing the fact that something broken had not quite been fixed, but it had finally been named. Later that night, the courtroom was empty, but the light above the bench was still on. A clerk cleaning the floors found a note resting where the judge had once sat. The handwriting was steady, but the words carried a weight that could not be measured in ink alone. To all who watched me fall silent, it read, "Thank you for showing me who I was, and for reminding me who I still have time to become." And as for Micah, he walked home with steady steps, his head neither lowered nor lifted in pride. He did not check his phone. He did not search for his name in the news. He had no need for headlines anymore, because once upon a time he used to lie when people asked who his father was. He would shrug, change the subject, or say he did not know. But now he no longer needed to, because the truth had spoken, and for once it had stayed. E-stories stay with us not because they shout, but because they whisper something true. Micah's journey wasn't just about a courtroom or a forgotten name. It was about courage without anger, dignity without force, and truth that didn't need to scream to be heard. This story reminds us that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes from a boy who simply refuses to look away, who chooses to speak, even when the world tries to silence him. And in doing so, he gave voice to everyone who's ever felt invisible. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, pause, or feel something deep inside, please, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, where every quiet voice finds its place and every moment of silence has meaning. Your support means more than you know. It gives our small team the strength to keep crafting stories that matter, stories that honor the unheard and hold up the mirror to what still needs to change. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories. We remember, we remind, we echo. Thank you for being here and for helping us make every story count.